In this video, I'm going to share 7 DAW mistakes that I've made in the past, or DAW mistakes. And by sharing them with you, I want to help you avoid wasting time by making the same mistakes. But first, be sure to download our free home studio setup guide, where I reveal the 9 essential items that every studio needs. There's a link in the bio or on screen now. Hey, Rob here from Musician on a Mission. Let's dive right in with mistake number 1, which was not setting up routing before I started the mix. So let's say you've got a new project like this and you're pretty much ready to start mixing as long as the whole thing is roughly organized, you've renamed the channels. You might be tempted to dive right in. However, I think there's a lot more that's worth doing in the mix prep process, and one of those is setting up your buses now. So if you don't understand how buses and routing and groups and all that works in your DAW, then that's definitely something you need to learn. But at this point in the process, I just want to set up my kind of main groups. So I might have a group here for my drums, and then I can call that drums. And then everything else, they kind of are doing their own thing. We've only got 1 bass and 1 guitar and 1 keys in this track. If I had several keys, several guitars, I might put them onto group instruments, but I'm still going to send these to their own groups because then I can do a lot of my mixing in the kind of group bus section. So let's start with the vocals, which we actually do have 2 different vocal channels. And then I'm still going to send the keys to its own bus, guitar, and finally bass. So I'll go through and rename those. And now that I've done this in the prep process before I start mixing, it's going to save me time, and you can take this a step further. I could set up some reverb channels. I might want to do that on another set of sends. Add my reverb plugin here. You get the idea. So for ages, I did this when I was mixing, but when you're in the heat of the mix and your ears are becoming more and more fatigued, you don't want to be wasting time on stuff like this. Instead, it makes a lot of sense to do it before you start mixing as part of the mix prep process. Mistake number 2 is that I only used project templates. So I have a pretty good template that I use for most mixes, and all I have to do is go to my templates, general, and this will already have some of the grouping and the effect bus set up like I just showed you. So it saves me some time and I don't have to set that up every single time I start a new mix. However, it took me a long time to realize there's lots of other forms of templates and presets you can use that will speed up your mixing and mix prep workflow. One of them that I really like now is channel strip presets. So you can see at the top here, at least in Logic, we have this preset called Reverb Bus. Now, if for some reason I don't set up this Reverb Bus in a mix, or let's say I end up deleting this lead vocal channel, and then when I start mixing, I'm like, oh, I don't have a lead vocal set up. I could add all the plugins that I normally use, but because I've got this set up, I can just go to Lead Vox, and then I've got the plugins that I use on the lead vocal channel itself, Auto Tune, EQ, etc. Now the same goes for reverb, the same goes for stereo delay. I actually have more kind of reverb buses set up. Of course, if these are part of your project template anyway, might not be as useful, but you can set up different channel presets for different effects that you don't use as much. Maybe you don't use stereo slapback delay that often, so it's not in your project template, where you could set up as a channel strip preset so that when you just create a new send in the heat of the mix, you think, I want to add some stereo delay to this, you create that send. Instead of then having to add your stereo delay plugin and maybe your EQ and other stuff you want to add to that strip, you can just go to your channel strip presets. That makes it a lot quicker. And then also don't forget about plugin presets. That makes it a lot easier as well. For example, on my go-to reverb, I have just my favorite room set up as room reverb. And every time I load up a mix, this is in my project template anyway, but if I wanted to add it on another channel, I've got my preset there. It's a room that I like the sound of. It's the kind of general settings that I normally start with, so it saves me a bit of time. Mistake number 3 is that I used to leave the buffer size on just one setting. I think I read somewhere that you should kind of set it in the middle and then you don't have to change it. But in reality, you want to change the buffer size depending on what you're doing. So when you're recording, you want less latency. So you use the smallest possible buffer size. You can see here, it tells me the resulting latency. However, when you're mixing, you then want to change this to the highest buffer size, and that gives you more latency. So when you hit the play bar, there's going to be a 136 millisecond delay, but it also gives the computer more processing power, more time, essentially, to process the different plugins, and it means you're less likely to get a CPU choke where it just stops playing and says, hey, the system is kind of overloading here. So make sure you go back and forth between these buffer sizes, low buffer size for recording, and then as soon as you start editing, mixing, you're not doing any more recording, change it to a higher buffer size, and then you can just leave it like that. Mistake number 4, and this time we're going to go a bit deeper into group processing and group buses, is that I only used 1 layer of groups. So that first mix I showed you, I set up a group for the drums, a group for the vocals, and then a group for each individual instrument as well. So I had 1 layer of groups. However, you can see in my project template here, I actually have two layers. I've got subs or subgroups and then groups. Now the reason for this, if I add some channels here and let's just pretend there's some audio on them. So let's say we have this kind of setup. We've got a drum kit with two mics on the snare, and then a bass mic and a bass DI, and then guitars. Now you could just send all of these to the drum group, and we've already got them set up, so I just pick bus 11, I could rename it, or bus 10 and rename this. But then when it comes to the snare, I've got two mics on it. So I might actually want to mix them together. Instead of mixing them separately, I might want to just blend the top and the bottom mic and then mix that as if it was one mic. So for that, I will use subgroups. So if I send this to sub 2, call this snare sub. Now I'm going to send all the other drums straight to the drum group, and we can call that drums. And then I also want to make sure I send the snare sub to the drum group. So now we've got two layers of groups. We've got the audio channels, then we've got just the snare top and bottom going to its own sub, and then below that again we've got a whole group bus. So it's like they're funneling in on three different levels. So now I can just balance my snare top and my snare bottom together, add my EQ, my compression, all that kind of stuff to the snare sub, and mix it as if it was just one channel instead of having to do them separately. Of course, if I then want to add EQ and treat these differently, maybe I want to add a high pass filter to the snare bottom, I can do that on the channel itself. But then any kind of tonal shaping where I'm thinking, oh, the whole snare just needs more crack, I can do that here. Whenever I say that, I always get an image of a snare smoking crack, and that makes no sense. But you get the idea, and you could do the same with the bass here. So I've got bass mic and bass DI. I could send them to a bass sub, and then that might go to an all guitars group. So think about these different layers of group channels. You don't have to just use one layer. And for ages, I didn't think of doing this, so I had some weird stuff going on with my routing. Mistake number 5 is that I used to send things to the wrong output all the time. So as soon as you start getting more complex in terms of your routing, and also if you do something like this where you set up your own kind of virtual mix bus, and this is quite common if you're using references inside your DAW, you don't want to add processing to your references, so you have to set up a virtual mix bus here. So all my final groups are going to this mix bus, and that means I can move my mix bus processing over to this channel so that if I pull a reference into the project, all of my mix bus processing isn't going to affect the reference as well. But now let's say I decide I want to add a new effect bus. I want to actually add a slightly different reverb, like a shorter reverb. So often I would add this bus and then I would add my reverb and I would leave it at that. I'd set it up and just keep going. But I missed something crucial here. And did you notice it? I left this as the stereo out. So now this isn't going through any of my mix bus processing. I can't tell you how many times I did this, it's kind of stupid. But you just have to remind yourself every single time, if you're going down this route, or even if you're setting up subgroups, you want to make sure they're then sent to the group. So same thing here, this bass sub is now going straight to the stereo out because I haven't set up going to its own group yet. And also I realized I just sent the effect channels there to the mix bus, but I didn't send these groups. So I kind of messed up there again. So you just want to be really vigilant every time you set up new channels. If you're doing anything like this or doing layers of groups, you just want to check every now and then and every time you set up a new channel and make sure you don't miss anything. Make sure everything's kind of going to the right place. So again, here, that should be going to the mix bus. And you want to just kind of check that every now and then. You could set that up as part of your project template as well to make sure you don't make any mistakes there. But then if you create new channels, you still have to think about this. Mistake number 6, and that's that I only used input monitoring inside my DAW. So if I was recording a lead vocal, let's say for example this channel here, and I set that up with the channel that my mic is currently going into, I could then hit input monitor. I'm not going to do it because you'll hear my voice twice, but then I can hear myself back through the DAW. So let's say I'm recording vocals and I want to hear myself in the headphones instead of taking one ear off. But the issue with that is even if you set the buffer size to the lowest setting, which we've already covered, even if you've got a really good interface that goes over Thunderbolt, you're still going to get some latency. And what that means is there's going to be a slight delay between when you sing and when you hear it back. We're going back a long time here, but that's all I used to do. I didn't realize there was another option, so I used to just kind of deal with the latency. But instead, what you should do is use the direct monitor function on your audio interface. Some audio interfaces just have a switch, and then you'll hear through the audio interface yourself directly. It's not going into your DAW, back out, which adds that delay. Instead, it's instant. So you can switch that on. For my interface, I actually have some software that does that. So a lot of interfaces have this as well. So I can unmute this and then I'd be able to hear myself back. But the main thing is just be aware of direct monitoring and don't rely on input monitoring in your DAW because it will add latency. Obviously, there's certain situations where you have to do that. For example, if you're using an amp simulator or if you want reverb on your voice, but then you can even blend the two together. So let's say I want to track vocals channels with reverb, but I don't want the latency. Well, I can turn on direct monitoring so I can hear the dry vocal back in instant time without any delay. Then I could add some reverb to the channel that I'm recording, and I could make this 100% wet, so that all I'm getting back through the DAW is a slightly delayed reverb, but that's fine. We won't really notice that. So then I can just turn this fader up or down until I'm happy with the amount of reverb. Obviously I need to hit the input monitoring button as well. And that means I'm hearing the direct vocal from my interface, and I'm hearing a slightly delayed reverb from the DAW, but because it's the reverb, it doesn't really matter. So there are ways of working around this, and just don't make the mistake that I did. Don't rely on input monitoring. It took me probably a whole year to figure that out when I got started. And then finally, mistake number 7 is spending too much time deliberating between different DAWs. This is such a common argument online. What DAW do you use? What DAW's the best? That kind of stuff. They're all basically the same. I'm not even going to go into what I recommend, because whatever DAW you've already got, just stick with it. They all have very similar features, unless there's a massive issue with the DAW that you have with compatibility, or maybe you've just got like a really old version that's 10 years old and it is time to upgrade and you want to switch DAWs. I don't know. If there's a real reason why, then sure. But if you're just seeing other DAWs out there and you saw that Studio One's got some cool new features, and you see me using Logic and you think, that looks pretty cool. I already know Cubase quite well, but I might give that a go. Complete waste of time. They all have pretty similar features. They all get the job done, and they all work in similar ways. And they all have their own little intricacies. So once you've learnt a DAW, it takes a lot of time to learn a new one. And that's time that you could have spent making music, mixing, doing the stuff you actually enjoy doing. Of course, your DAW is only one part of your home studio setup, and I've got a guide that I want to share with you that takes you through the 9 essential items that every studio needs. If you're new to home recording, or you just want to be sure that your home studio is set up properly, you can click the link in the description to get access to that, or click the link on screen now. It's quite an in-depth ebook, but I wanted to share that with you for free. So that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you next time, and remember, create regardless.